There are houses where the walls remember, where the floorboards hold secrets that were never meant to leave. In the spring of 1958, a journalist named Victoria Brennan walked through the front door of the Ashford Manor in Charleston, South Carolina. She carried a leather notebook, a camera, and a theory about what had really happened there 20 years earlier. The neighbors watched her go inside at 3:47 in the afternoon. They watched the sun set. They watched the lights go out, but they never saw Victoria Brennan leave. Her car remained parked on the street for 6 days before police finally entered. What they found inside changed nothing in the official record, but it changed everything for those who knew where to look. This is not a ghost story. This is something far more disturbing. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Ashford Manor stood at the corner of Whitmore Avenue and Lancaster Street, built in 1855, by a man who understood that architecture could be a kind of armor. Jonathan Ashford designed every room with intention. The windows faced specific directions. The doors locked from the inside in ways that made no sense unless you understood what he was trying to keep out or keep in. For 80 years, the house changed hands through inheritance, never sold. The Ashford family passed it down like a curse they couldn't refuse. Each generation lived there. Each generation left quietly. No one spoke about why. Then came 1938. The Depression was draining life from Charleston, and the house stood empty for the first time in its history. Edward Ashford, the last direct descendant, had died the previous winter. His will was specific. The house could not be sold. It could not be demolished. It had to remain exactly as it was, maintained by a trust fund he'd established until certain conditions were met. The will never specified what those conditions were. The lawyer who drafted it died 2 weeks after Edward of a heart attack. They said he was 36 years old. The house sat empty for 3 years. Then in the spring of 1941, a family named the Thorntons moved in. They weren't Ashfords. They had no blood connection, but they'd won the house in a legal battle over the will's validity. The trust fought them. The Historical Society fought them. Even the neighbors, in their quiet Southern way, made it clear the Thorntons weren't welcome. But Robert Thornton was a stubborn man. He'd served in the Great War. He'd seen real horror. He wasn't afraid of an old house with a complicated history. His wife, Eleanor, was less certain, but she followed her husband's lead. They moved in on March 8, 1941. Their daughter, Clara, was 7 years old. 6 months later, Clara Thornton stopped speaking. The doctors called it selective mutism brought on by trauma, but Clara hadn't experienced any trauma they could identify. She simply stopped talking one morning at breakfast. Her parents found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the wall. When they asked what was wrong, she turned to look at them with eyes that seemed to see something they couldn't. She never spoke again. Not a word, not a sound. For the next 43 years. The Thorntons lasted 18 months in the Ashford Manor. They never publicly explained why they left. Robert told the movers to be quick. Eleanor supervised with the kind of rigid control that comes from barely holding yourself together. Clara, now 9 years old and still silent, carried a single item from her room, a stuffed bear that she'd owned since infancy. She left everything else behind: the dolls, the books, the carefully arranged furniture that Eleanor had chosen to make the room feel safe. Years later, when a reporter asked Eleanor what happened in that house, she said only this: "My daughter knew something we didn't, and by the time we understood, it was already too late to protect her from it." The house sat empty again 14 months this time. The trust resumed control, paying for maintenance, keeping the gardens trimmed, ensuring the structure remained sound, but no one stayed inside after dark. The groundskeeper, a man named Walter Pierce, would arrive at dawn and leave before 4:00 in the afternoon. He refused to work later. When his supervisor pressed him about it, Walter said something strange. He said the house had a schedule, that certain things only happened after the sun went below the roofline. He wouldn't elaborate. 2 weeks after that conversation, Walter stopped showing up for work entirely. His wife said he'd taken a job in Atlanta, but Walter Pierce never worked in Atlanta. City records show no employment, no address, no trace of him after he left Charleston. He simply disappeared into whatever life people build when they're running from something they can't explain. In 1956, the Historical Preservation Society of South Carolina contacted a young journalist named Victoria Brennan. Victoria had made a name for herself writing about Southern Gothic architecture and the families who inhabited these old homes. She approached history like archaeology, carefully excavating layers of story until she found the truth underneath. The society wanted her to write a feature about the Ashford Manor. They were trying to secure landmark status, and they needed positive press to counter the rumors that had accumulated around the property. Victoria accepted the assignment, but she had her own reasons for saying yes. Victoria's grandmother had worked as a housemaid for the Ashford family in the 1880s. She'd been young then, only 16, and she'd lasted 3 weeks before quitting without explanation. Victoria had discovered her grandmother's diary the previous year after the funeral. In it, she'd written about the house, about sounds that came from rooms that should have been empty, about doors that locked themselves from the inside, about a presence that moved through the halls with intention and intelligence. The final entry was dated September 22, 1889. It read, "I cannot return to that house. Mr. Ashford says I am hysterical. Perhaps I am, but I know what I heard coming from the 3rd floor, and I know it was not wind. It was not the house settling. It was something that has learned to sound almost human. Almost." Victoria Brennan spent 2 months preparing before she ever set foot inside the Ashford Manor. She requested blueprints from the city archives. She interviewed former residents, though most refused to speak on record. She compiled newspaper clippings dating back to 1867. What she found was a pattern, not of violence exactly, but of silence. Families moved in, families moved out, and in between, nothing. No parties, no social events, no complaints to the police, just these long stretches of quiet habitation followed by sudden, unexplained departures. The average stay was 14 months. No family ever made it past 2 years. She found something else in those archives, something the Historical Society hadn't mentioned. In 1904, a fire had started on the 3rd floor of the Ashford Manor. The fire department responded within minutes, but when they arrived, the fire had already extinguished itself. The room was cold. The windows were closed. There was no source of water, no explanation for how the flames had died. The fire chief's report noted extensive burn damage to the floor and walls, but he also noted something peculiar. The damage formed a pattern, a circle roughly 8 feet in diameter, perfectly centered in the room, and inside that circle the floorboards were untouched, completely pristine, as if the fire had deliberately burned around something or someone. Victoria wrote to the trust that managed the property. She requested permission to spend 24 hours inside the house alone, documenting its architecture and history. She framed it as essential research for the article. The trust denied her request. Too dangerous, they said. The house had been unoccupied for too long. There were concerns about structural integrity. Victoria wrote back. She had experience with old buildings and understood the risks. She would sign any waiver they required. The trust denied her again. This time, they didn't offer a reason. So Victoria did what any good journalist would do. She found another way in. Through public records, she discovered that Walter Pierce, the groundskeeper who disappeared, had kept a key. His wife still lived in Charleston. Victoria visited her in early February of 1958. Mrs. Pierce was hesitant at first, but Victoria showed her the diary, her grandmother's words from 69 years earlier. Mrs. Pierce read it slowly. When she finished, she looked up at Victoria with something like recognition. She said Walter had dreams about that house for months after he stopped working there. He'd wake up talking about the 3rd floor, about something he'd seen through the window one afternoon. He never told me what it was, but after those dreams started, he couldn't stay in Charleston anymore. He said the house knew where we lived. Then she went to a kitchen drawer and retrieved a brass key. She placed it in Victoria's hand and closed her fingers around it. "If you're going in there," she said, "go during the day and don't stay past sunset. Whatever you're looking for, it's not worth being there after dark." Victoria Brennan entered the Ashford Manor on March 18, 1958, at 3:47 in the afternoon. A neighbor, Mrs. Harriet Dalton, noted the time because she'd been watching from her window across the street. She'd lived in that house for 32 years and had watched families come and go from the Ashford Manor. She'd learned to pay attention. Later, she would tell police that Victoria had paused at the front door, that she'd stood there for nearly a minute with her hand on the brass handle before finally turning it, that she'd looked back once at the street, as if memorizing what the world looked like from the outside. Inside, Victoria found a house frozen in time. The Thorntons had left furniture behind. The trust had maintained everything exactly as it was. Sheets covered the sofas in the parlor. The dining room table was set for 3, as if the family had simply stepped away mid-meal and never returned. In the kitchen, Victoria found a calendar still turned to August 1942. Someone had circled the 23rd. No notation, just the circle drawn in red ink. Victoria photographed it. She photographed everything: the grand staircase, the library with its walls of books that no one had read in 16 years, the second-floor bedrooms with their carefully made beds. She found Clara Thornton's room at the end of the hall. The door was closed but unlocked. Inside, everything remained as a 9-year-old girl had left it. Dolls arranged on shelves, a small desk with crayons scattered across the surface, and on the wall above the bed, a drawing. Victoria stepped closer. It was crude, the way children's drawings are. Stick figures, a house, but something about it made Victoria's skin tighten. The house in the drawing had a 3rd floor, and in the 3rd floor window, Clara had drawn a face, not a stick figure, but a detailed, carefully rendered face with hollow eyes and a mouth open in an expression that could have been screaming or laughing. Victoria couldn't tell which. Beneath the drawing, in a child's uneven handwriting, were 3 words: "It sees me." Victoria checked her watch. 4:32. She had maybe 3 hours of good daylight left. Mrs. Pierce's warning echoed in her mind: don't stay past sunset. But Victoria hadn't come this far to leave without seeing the 3rd floor. She'd read about the fire, about the circle of undamaged floorboards, about the window Walter Pierce had looked through. Whatever story this house was hiding, it was up there. She stood at the base of the stairs leading to the 3rd floor. The air felt different here, colder, dense in a way that made breathing feel deliberate. She put her hand on the railing. The wood was smooth, too smooth, as if countless hands had gripped it in exactly the same spot over decades. She climbed. The 3rd floor consisted of a single hallway with 4 doors. 3 were open, 1 was closed. Victoria photographed the hallway first. Her camera was a Rolleiflex, reliable and precise. She'd taken hundreds of photographs that afternoon, documenting every room, every detail. But when she developed the film weeks later, when police finally released her effects to her sister, the photographs from the 3rd floor would show something impossible. In every frame, there was a shadow not cast by anything visible, not following the laws of light and angle, just a dark shape that appeared in the corner of each image, always in the same position relative to the camera, always watching. Victoria entered the first open room. It was empty except for a rocking chair facing the window. The chair was positioned precisely in the center of the room, and beneath it, she could see the marks on the floor. The wood was worn in 2 curved lines where the rockers had moved back and forth over and over for what must have been years. But the chair wasn't moving now. It sat perfectly still. Victoria approached the window and looked out. From here, she could see Mrs. Dalton's house across the street. She could see her own car parked at the curb. She could see the angle Walter Pierce would have had when he looked up that afternoon and saw whatever it was that made him leave Charleston forever. The second room was smaller, a servant's quarters perhaps. There was a bed frame without a mattress and a small table. On the table sat a water glass, still half full. Victoria touched it. The water was ice cold. Impossible, she thought. The house had no electricity, no running water. The utilities had been shut off for years. She lifted the glass and saw underneath it a ring stained into the wood. An old stain, decades old. Someone had placed a glass of water in this exact spot so many times that it had become permanent. She set it back down, matching the ring precisely. The third room held the fire damage. The circle was still visible on the floor, just as the fire chief had described in 1904, 54 years later, and the burn marks remained dark and clear. Victoria knelt at the edge of the circle and ran her fingers along the boundary. The transition was absolute. Charred wood on one side, untouched floor on the other, no gradation, no fatting, as if the fire had recognized a border it could not cross. She took out her notebook and began to sketch the pattern. And that's when she noticed the scratches, deep gouges in the untouched floorboards inside the circle. They formed words. She had to lie flat on the floor to read them in the fading light. It was not a fire, it was a door. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. Victoria Brennan checked her watch. 5:51. The sun was low. She could feel the light changing, becoming angular and thin. She had perhaps 20 minutes before sunset. The closed door waited at the end of the hall. She'd saved it for last, though she couldn't explain why. Some instinct told her that once she opened that door, something would change. The house would know she'd seen everything. And houses like this, houses that remember, they don't forget who opens their doors. She stood outside the room for a long time, long enough that the light shifted perceptibly, long enough that the shadows in the hallway deepened and spread. Her hand was on the doorknob when she heard it. A sound from downstairs, soft, rhythmic, the creak of wood under pressure, back and forth, back and forth. The rocking chair, the one she'd seen in the first room, the one that had been perfectly still, it was moving now. She could hear it clearly in the silence of the house. And then underneath that sound, something else. Breathing, slow and deliberate, the kind of breathing that comes from effort, from concentration, from waiting. Victoria turned the doorknob. The door opened easily, as if it had been expecting her. The room beyond was dark, darker than it should have been with the windows she could see from outside. She stepped across the threshold, and the temperature dropped so severely that her breath came out in visible clouds. Her camera hung around her neck. She raised it and looked through the viewfinder, using it like a shield between herself and whatever occupied this space. Through the lens, she could see more clearly. The room wasn't empty. There was furniture, a bed, a dresser, a mirror on the wall, and in the mirror. Victoria lowered the camera. She turned to look at what the mirror was reflecting, but there was nothing behind her, just the open doorway and the hall beyond. She looked back at the mirror. The reflection showed something different. It showed the room as it had been, fully furnished, lived in. And standing in the doorway of that reflected room was a figure, a woman in a long dress from another era. Her face was turned away, but Victoria could see her shoulders, could see the way she stood with absolute stillness, could see that she was looking at something in the reflection that Victoria couldn't see, looking at where Victoria was standing. The breathing sound grew louder. Victoria realized it wasn't coming from downstairs anymore. It was coming from inside the room with her. From the corner she couldn't quite see, from the space between the furniture and the wall where the shadows had grown thick enough to have weight. She raised her camera again and took a photograph. The flash filled the room with light for a fraction of a second. And in that brief illumination, Victoria saw what Jonathan Ashford had built this house to contain, what every family since had lived above, unknowingly, what Clara Thornton had finally seen clearly enough to stop speaking forever. The flash faded, the darkness returned, and Victoria Brennan understood that some doors, once opened, cannot be closed again. When police entered the Ashford Manor 6 days later, they found Victoria Brennan's car still parked on the street. The key Walter Pierce's wife had given her was still in the front door lock, turned but not removed. Her leather bag sat in the entrance hall, its contents carefully arranged. Her notebook was open to the last page she'd written. The entry was dated March 18, 1958, and timed at 6:04 in the evening, just after sunset. It read, "I understand now why the families leave, why Clara stopped speaking, why my grandmother ran. It's not that the house is haunted, it's that the house is a container. And what it contains has been here since before Jonathan Ashford laid the first stone. He didn't build a home, he built a prison. And the third floor isn't the top of the house, it's the lid." Victoria's camera was found in the third floor room with the closed door. The door was open now. The camera sat on the floor, positioned as if she'd set it down carefully. When police developed the film, most of the photographs showed exactly what they expected: empty rooms, dusty furniture, architectural details. But the final photograph, the one taken with the flash in that last room, showed only darkness. Not the darkness of underexposure or a malfunction, but a darkness that seemed to exist in front of the lens rather than behind it. As if the camera had photographed something that absorbed light rather than reflected it. The police photographer who processed the film quit his job 3 days later. He wouldn't say why, but those who saw him afterward said he'd developed a habit of leaving lights on in every room of his house, even during the day. Especially during the day. Victoria Brennan was never found. Not in the house, not in Charleston, not anywhere. Her family hired private investigators. The police conducted multiple searches. They brought dogs. They checked hospitals and morgues across 3 states. She had simply vanished as completely as if she'd never existed, except for one detail that Mrs. Dalton reported and the police initially dismissed. She said that on the evening of March 18th at approximately 6:17, she'd seen movement in the third-floor window of the Ashford Manor, a figure standing there looking out. But the figure didn't move like a person. It moved like someone learning how to move, practicing getting the gestures right. And even from across the street, Mrs. Dalton could tell something was wrong with its proportions. The arms were too long. The head tilted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible. She watched it for perhaps 30 seconds before it stepped back from the window and disappeared into the darkness of the room. The Ashford Manor was finally demolished in 1966. The Historical Society fought it. The trust that managed the property fought it, but the city council voted unanimously. Too many disappearances, they said. Too many stories, too much history that no one wanted to preserve. The demolition crew worked only during daylight hours. They refused to leave equipment on the property overnight. The foreman later reported that on the final day when they brought down the third floor, the air smelled wrong, not like dust and old wood, but like something that had been sealed away for a very long time and had finally found an opening. The crew finished the job in record time. They piled the rubble and burned it. All of it, the wood, the fixtures, even the stones from the foundation. They burned it until nothing remained but ash. And then they buried the ash 12 feet deep and paved over it with concrete. There's a parking lot there now. People use it every day without thinking about what lies beneath. But sometimes late in the evening, when the sun is setting and the light hits the pavement at a certain angle, drivers report seeing a shadow near the back corner of the lot. A shadow that doesn't match any object. A shadow that seems to be standing rather than lying flat. And if you're there at exactly 6:17 in the evening, the same time Mrs. Dalton saw the figure in the window, you might notice something else. The shadow breathes slowly, deliberately, the way something does when it's been waiting a very long time and has finally learned patience. Victoria Brennan's notebook was donated to the South Carolina Historical Society by her sister. It remains in their archives, available to researchers by appointment, but very few people request it. And those who do rarely stay long enough to read past that final entry, because there's one more line written below her observation about the house being a prison. It's in different handwriting, shakier, written quickly, perhaps in darkness. It says, if you're reading this, don't look up from the page. It's standing behind you now. It's been standing there since you started reading, and it's learning.